In this video, we're going to analyze the impact of different policies. Specifically, we want to see how the policies are going to affect the equilibrium interest rate as well as the quantity of loanable funds supplied and demanded. So let's suppose we have a situation where there's a change in the demand for loanable funds. So an example of this might be Congress decides to pass an investment tax credit. An investment tax credit, we discussed earlier, is this tax break given to firms who purchase new machinery, new equipment. So whenever they make these purchases, they can subtract these purchases from their tax bill, which means basically it will reduce the amount that they owe to the government. So it's like a subsidy. It will make purchasing capital cheaper for the firm. So what's that going to do? That's going to give the firms the incentive to buy more capital at any given interest rate. So they will want to borrow more money. So remember, it is the borrowers who are demanding loanable funds. What will happen? The demand for loanable funds will increase. What we see is that at the original interest rate, we currently have a shortage. So firms want to borrow more money than what's available at this interest rate. They will compete against each other, driving the interest rate up. And as they do, as that interest rate is going up, the quantity of loanable funds demanded will decrease. But as interest rates go up, we see that the quantity of savings will increase until we reach a new equilibrium. So in this particular case, what do we see? The investment tax credit is going to increase the quantity of loanable funds. And remember what that means. That means that the amount of savings has increased and the amount of investment has increased. Because at these particular equilibrium quantities, since we're in a closed economy, savings is equal to investment. So relative to Q naught here, at Q1, the economy is saving more, they're investing more, and of course what this means is more capital accumulation. This is going to stimulate the economy to grow. And of course all of this is done because the equilibrium interest rate has increased from I naught to I1. Now let's consider a policy that affects the supply of loanable funds. In this case, let's suppose that Congress decides to increase the tax rate on savings income. Increase the tax rate on your savings income. So remember, savers receive a small fee, we call it an interest rate, for every dollar that they lend. And so the government's decided that they're going to tax that income at a higher rate. What that will do is reduce the incentive to save. So the supply of savings curve will shift to the left. When it shifts to the left, we see that we are no longer in equilibrium at the original interest rate. We currently have a shortage. Firms want to borrow more money than what the households are willing to provide. And this will put some pressure on the interest rates to go up. As the interest rate starts to rise, households decide to save more. As the interest rate rises, the amount of investment will decrease until we eventually get to an equilibrium, which will result in a higher interest rate in the economy. This will also result in a lower quantity of loanable funds. And that lower quantity implies that both the level of savings has decreased and the level of investment. So the implications for this in the long run mean that we're going to reduce the amount of capital that we're willing and able to hold, all else equal, and so that would actually cause the economy to contract. Now up to this point, we've assumed that it's the firms doing the borrowing, but the government can also borrow money. The government would borrow money by selling bonds or issuing bonds. Well, if the government decides to borrow more money and issue more bonds, that means that there's going to be an increase in the demand for loanable funds. So if we assume that at this original demand curve, this just represents the amount of loanable funds that are being demanded for investment purposes, we now have not only firms that are borrowing money, but also the government. and that's going to shift the demand for loanable funds out to the right. And this new demand curve would represent how much at any given interest rate that the firms as well as the government are willing to borrow. And so let's see what will happen in this scenario. Well, we have the increase in demand, and given the increase in demand, you have a shortage. That's going to drive interest rates up until we get to this new equilibrium. So we're going to end up with higher interest rates in the economy. And notice that there will also be a higher quantity of loanable funds. But let's break this down. Remember, the quantity of funds that are being borrowed here are being used both for investment purposes, so to buy capital, as well as for government funding. But let's decompose this total amount of funding down into these two parts. At this original interest rate, if we go over to the original demand curve, we see how much at that interest rate firms want to borrow. And firms, we see at that interest rate, are only willing to borrow this amount as opposed to the amount they were originally willing to borrow. Who's borrowing the difference? Again, if this is the total amount of borrowing, then the difference is what is going to the government. The amount of savings in the economy has increased because remember, at each of these equilibrium quantities, that quantity represents the amount of savings in the economy. And so the amount of savings has increased. The amount of savings is equal to Q1. The amount of borrowing is equal to I1 plus G1. And so you have more savings and less investment. So government borrowing causes the investment to go down in the economy. It also causes the amount of savings to go up, but what that means is if people are saving more, that implies that they are consuming less. This decrease in investment and this decrease in consumption is what is known as crowding out. The government, by borrowing more money and driving up interest rates, is crowding out investment as well as consumption.